Committee will come to order. Looking back at my notes from 10 years ago when Mr. Smith chaired what is now the Emerging Threats and Capabilities Subcommittee and I was the ranking member, I found a number of references to preparing for cyber as a new domain of warfare. This committee has held many hearings and briefings on this topic over the last decade, and we are continuing with more this week, led by Chairwoman Stefanik and Ranking Member Langevin. We've also enacted a number of legislative provisions and authorized a lot of funding, and there's no doubt a lot of progress has been made in building up our military and intelligence capabilities in cyberspace. But I do not think it's an exaggeration to say that our nation has still not faced up to the threat. Cybersecurity means lots of things. Part of what it means is going on down the hall in another hearing, but part of it is what we're going to talk about today. Threats to national security in cyberspace come from adversaries stealing information. Sometimes it comes from adversaries working to manipulate our decisions and American public opinion. Part of it is the potential to disrupt our economy and unleash havoc with our financial system or electric grid or public health and sanitation. And I have not even begun to discuss the consequences for the effects of our military's ability to operate. We still have not answered the fundamental question of what we expect the federal government to do to defend our citizens, our businesses, our infrastructure, and our society in cyber. Meanwhile, the capabilities of our adversaries and their willingness to use them is growing far faster than our response. The Director of National Intelligence recently assessed, quote, the potential for surprise in the cyber realm will increase in the next year and beyond as billions more digital devices are connected with relatively little built-in security and both nation states and malign actors become more emboldened and better equipped in the use of increasingly widespread cyber toolkits. Fortunately, our witnesses today have a lot of experience and a lot of expertise in these issues, and I'm grateful to each of them for their willingness to share their views today in the hopes that not just our committee, but the Congress and the country can move at the appropriate pace in confronting these challenges. Mr. Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I agree completely with the Chairman's opening remarks and will not repeat them. We all know the importance of cybersecurity. I think the Chairman outlined it very well. The challenges that I'm most interested in hearing from the three of you on, and we've all been people who have been working on this for a long time, is number one, how can we better coordinate the effort? Because whether it's 1,000 points of failure and then some, when it comes to cybersecurity. And within DoD alone, I mean, forget about the contractors and all the other pieces of our cyber network that are vulnerable to attack. Within DoD, I still don't think it's clear who's in charge. I don't think it's clear what the strategy is, and I don't think all the key components at DoD have any idea really exactly what the plan is. Or overstatement to say no idea, but they don't have a clearer plan. So how could we develop that agenda so that within DoD we have people who are clearly in charge? When you say, okay, what's going on in cyber? This is the chain of command, and this is what's going on with it and how we respond to it. Second, I do want to just emphasize one point the Chairman made, and that is when it comes to information campaigns and disinformation campaigns, cyber has taken these to a whole new level. And I guess one of my frustrations is while it's taken it to a whole new level on the one hand, on the other hand, it's nothing new. I mean, the medium is new. Disinformation, information, whether it's through the radio or newspapers or whatever the medium of the time was, we've been doing that since the beginning of this country, and yet we seem to be unbelievably slow to respond to using this new tool, this new medium, for spreading the story that we want to spread. Whereas in contrast, certainly Russia, but I also think China have been incredibly aggressive and are unquestionably ahead of us in using this technology. How do we catch up? And the last thing, great debate about storing information in the cloud, using open source software versus closed source software. And I have had a number of very, very smart people from out in Seattle passionately argue to me that we can better deal with cyber the more stuff we have in the cloud and the more we rely on open source software, that it is a better You can better protect that type of software. So I'm curious what your guys' thoughts are on the cloud and open source and how it fits into us developing that cyber strategy that we so desperately need. And with that, I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
We're pleased to welcome the Honorable Michael Chertoff, co-founder and executive chairman of the Chertoff Group, and of course also former Secretary of Homeland Security. General Keith Alexander, founder and chief executive officer, IronNet Cybersecurity, former director of the National Security Agency, and the Honorable Jeh Johnson, partner Paul, Weiss, Rifkind, Wharton, and Garrison, but also former Secretary of Homeland Security and General Counsel to the Department of Defense, which may play a role here. Without objection, each of your written statements will be made part of the record, and we'd be pleased to hear whatever oral comments you'd like to make at this point. Secretary Chertoff.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Ranking Member Smith. I appreciate the opportunity to testify. I thought I had testified before pretty much every committee in Congress, but I hadn't before this one, so you've moved me towards a perfect record or a royal flush. I think this is a very timely hearing, and maybe not quite as well attended as the one down the hall, but in many ways, I think focusing on an area that requires greater attention. And I think that the opening remarks, I think, make that point very well. Let me just very briefly summarize a couple of points. First of all, there's no question in my mind the threats have increased in intensity and frequency. We now are dealing with what I would call industrial-scale data theft, whether it's the billions of accounts on Yahoo that were stolen, or the OPM hack, which resulted in north of 20 million very sensitive files being taken. I mean, this is really theft on an industrial scale, and it applies to straight-out criminality as well as to things that are relevant for intelligence purposes. We have seen what we call information operations, the use of cyber means, including hacking, to disseminate data, which is part of an attempt to influence and disrupt our elections and our democracy. We've seen data destruction with ransomware, WannaCry, NotPetya, which has had a serious impact on civilian infrastructure in various parts of the world, including some major enterprises. And as was recently announced by DHS, we have found malware in much of our critical infrastructure, including our electric grid. And if you go back and look at the Ukraine in 2016 and 2017, Christmas time, the lights went out because of cyber attacks that were mounted against the electric infrastructure there. So there's no question whether it's theft of data and information or actually disruptive or destructive attacks, we've seen an increase in severity and frequency. Now, I want to be clear, though, about defining a couple of things. First, when we talk about protecting the data, we're talking about protecting confidentiality, availability, and integrity. That is different than the issue of the content itself. And I say that because I know the Russians have a concept of what they call information security, which to them means let's keep information we don't like off the network. We call that censorship in this country. And it's important not to confuse the two, because what we want to do to defend the availability, confidentiality, and integrity of data is a different set of considerations than when we deal with the issue of content that we happen to disagree with. So that being said, let me briefly just summarize a couple of points. First, as it relates to defense, I do think we have made some progress on unity of effort with the U.S. government, but not as much as we need. In theory, the major agencies that deal with cyber, Department of Defense, Homeland Security, and the FBI have distinct roles. And you have a lead role of one, for example, in a particular area, and the others support. But we need to make sure we exercise that and institutionalize it. As far as the private sector is concerned, the challenge is you've got widely distributed ownership and control of infrastructure and uneven capabilities and knowledge about how to defend that infrastructure. Some of the things we can do to make that a little bit easier are continuing to promote information sharing, particularly having it be automated, having the ability to use a common language to describe threats, and I would argue also making clearances a little bit more widely available to the private sector so that there can be greater in-depth sharing of information. I think the propagation of additional standards about what are considered to be good cyber defense measures will be helpful to the private sector. And I would also urge Congress look at the Safety Act, which has worked well in promoting counterterrorism technologies, as perhaps legislation that could be extended to counter cyber attacking technologies. And that, again, would incentivize the private sector to invest in better cyber defense. And the last area I would look at would be the so-called Internet of Things. We are seeing a dramatic expansion of the surface area of attacks through so-called smart objects that have very little provision for security or cyber defense, including basic things like patching and upgrading. And we may need to look at some legal regulations or policies that would promote some kind of at least minimal integration of security capabilities into these increasingly widespread smart devices. Finally, on the issue of what we might do in terms of either active defense or offense, I would argue that there are a couple of areas we should look at. And I don't think it's a capabilities issue as much as it is a policy and strategy issue. First, we need to be clear about standards for attribution. What do we expect in terms of the standard that we must meet to be confident about our attribution? And how would we announce to the world when we've attributed something in a way that we want to respond to? Second, I think we need to marshal all of the tools in the toolbox in terms of response. It can't only be a cyber response. Depending on the nature of the attack, it has to be potentially criminal prosecution, use of sanctions, and even the use of cyber and physical tools to preempt something in an appropriate case when we're dealing with something that threatens life or property. And finally, a couple of other areas where I think we need to focus on international responses. One is coordinating with our allies in NATO in terms of having a common doctrine and a common set of capabilities in cyber response, and then looking to creating a more robust set of international norms and rules about what is off limits in cyberspace as it is in physical space. Because right now we're not always clear about what ought to be considered to be illegal cyber activity under international law. And I think the time for some kind of a set of norms and laws in this respect is well overdue. So with that, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member, thank you very much, and I'll be pleased to answer questions.
Thank you. General Alexander.
Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Smith, distinguished members of the committee, it's an honor and privilege to be back here again. I want to hit, over the next the next 5 minutes, 5 key points. First, technology. You both mentioned it. We live in exponential times. The amount of applications, the amount of data, and the amount of technology is growing, almost doubling every year in each category. That means cyber is going to grow exponentially, and the problems that we have today, a year from now, will be more than twice as large. The threats are growing with that, and nation states are now using cyber as an element of national power, not only from criminal perspective, for stealing money and intellectual property, but now to impact other nation states. We see it in Ukraine, you saw it in Georgia, you saw it in Estonia. You see it now in the Middle East, in Kuwait, Bahrain, UAE, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia, and you see it in Japan and Taiwan and South Korea. Countries are being hit with nation-state attacks, and we should expect that those countries we have disagreements with will use cyber to attack us, and we're not ready. And the reason we're not ready is not because there aren't good people in government working hard. It's because, in my opinion, we don't have the policies in place. We don't understand the roles and responsibilities sufficiently between the departments, and we don't train between government and industry. Let me give you a few examples of what I think we need to do and why we need to do it. And then I'll end up with 4 key points that I think as a government we need to go forward on. With respect to the roles of government, It's clear, I think, the missions of the Department of Homeland Security for incident response, for setting standards. It's clear for the Department of Justice what the FBI does in terms of law enforcement, and clear in the mission of the Defense Department to defend the nation from cyber attacks, especially from nation states. The problem, government, one, can't see what's going on in cyberspace like we can in an integrated air defense system. You can't see it. And so most of our response is incident response and falls on Department of Homeland Security, who leverages everything the other departments have to help do that. But that's not what our nation needs. If you go out and talk to companies that have been attacked, they don't want you to come and tell you they've been attacked. They want help in stopping the attack. And to date, most people say it's too hard. In the Constitution, it says our government is here for the common defense. It doesn't say we're here for the common defense unless it's hard. We're here for the common defense unless it's fast, or we're here in the common defense unless it's in cyber. Our job, your job, is how we defend this country. And I believe it is doable. And the issue gets back to some of the things that you mentioned about the cloud. How do we leverage the cloud for pushing up a common picture in cyber where malicious acts are going? Technically achievable. And we need to drive towards a solution like that, that brings together our government players in a coherent, policy-provided path that allows our government to work with industry to actually defend this nation. And I think it's doable. My experience in talking to industry is they're more than willing, and we have given them the authority to share the necessary information with government under the CISA Act. We now need to make that real. But there are still several things that I think limit that sharing. One of them is liability protection and the concerns of liability. For small and mid-sized companies, how do we incentivize them to actually have good cyber and the ability to share real-time information? How do we share this information in a credible way and ensure that the information flow that goes back and forth between government and industry is there? And that may require, Secretary Chertoff said, clearances for many of those in industry. Let me give you one set of examples about how we could defend this country. Today, if a bad actor, so in running Cyber Command, we would look at how the threat looks at attacking our nation. They don't look at it by company. They look at by the effects they want to do to hurt our country. That means the energy sector, the finance sector, the healthcare sector, and the government. And what they do is they look for weak spots, they get in, and then they can cause damage from there. But we look at defending at a point, not collectively across sectors. So we now have to look at our nation and use cyber in a networked way, just like we have the internet, so that we can defend it at network speed. And I put that last part in there. It has to be, information sharing has to be at network speed if you want to stop the threat. And I believe that is viable and doable today and something that we should collectively push for. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Secretary Johnson.
Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Smith, members of this committee, it is a pleasure to return to the House Armed Services Committee. When I was General Counsel of the Department of Defense, I testified several times before this committee in the years 2009 to 2012. While I was Secretary of Homeland Security, I had the pleasure of testifying before Congress 26 times in 37 months. And since I've been a private citizen now for 14 months, I've testified. This will be my third time. As Senator Angus King said to me last month when I testified before the Senate Intel Committee, Mr. Secretary, how can I miss you if you never go away? And he's right. And one of these days I do expect to go away, but I welcome the opportunity to come here and testify with my two friends and colleagues on this important topic. You have my prepared statement in which I tried to describe the range of cybersecurity threats that I see, ranging from those that this committee is well acquainted with, the prospect of a nation-state cyber attack on our critical infrastructure, to the issue that the witness down the hall is probably testifying about, the inappropriate or unauthorized use of private data that American citizens make available on the internet. In my testimony, I also take on the legal question that many ask, what type of cyber attack may constitute an act of war? And I'll be happy to answer questions along those lines if the committee members have it. In general, I look forward to our discussion, and I'm pleased to be here with General Alexander and Secretary Chertoff. Thank you.
Let me just ask each of you to respond to kind of two high-level questions, I guess. One is, my perception is the threat is going up far faster than our response. We're getting more capable, but as at least a couple of you mentioned, our policy is not there. Do you agree with me, is the question, that the threat is growing faster than our response? And the second question is, and I'll broaden this to Congress, if you could wave a magic wand and have Congress do one thing this year in this area of cybersecurity, what would you like to see us do?
I guess I'll begin. I think the answer to the first question is I agree with you. I think the threat is increasing. I think, again, it's not on our side an issue with lack of capability. I think it is that we haven't firmed up a doctrine and a strategy for how to respond. We're beginning to see some response. I mean, I think, for example, in the criminal side, you're seeing some indictments. I think sanctions are a potential response. There may be things going on below the surface that are not visible, but there's no question that the threat is intensifying and the boldness of the bad actors is intensifying. In terms of what Congress can do, I think on the issues of strategy and doctrine, these are I think, matters really more for study than for some specific legislation. But I come back to the Safety Act. I think in dealing with the private sector, one of the issues I hear a lot is, well, how much do we invest and what's the return on investment in terms of cybersecurity? And one thing that I think was demonstrated in the counterterrorism area was the Safety Act really incentivized the private sector to invest in tools that could be used to counter terrorism. Because there was a liability protection that came with it. And I think extending that to cyber would be a very easy, straightforward thing that would begin to create some incentives for the private sector.
So I think, yes, the threat is going up exponentially, and technology is fueling that. So consider that they're getting more opportunities and going faster than our policy and doctrine is growing. So we're falling behind. And if I were to give you one thing, I liked yours, so I'll add two slightly different. We don't have a common operating picture for cyber. We can't see as a nation other nations attacking us. As a consequence, we have limited abilities to actually defend our nation at network speed, which is what will be required, I think, in the next few years. So one thing, if you could push to build a common operating picture for government and industry for attacks that are hitting our country.
Mr. Chairman, I agree with your assessment that the cyber threat to our country is getting worse. I believe it will get worse before it gets better, and I believe those of us on defense struggle to keep up. I think that bad cyber actors, ranging from nation states to criminals to activists to those who engage in ransomware, are becoming increasingly aggressive, creative, and tenacious. If I had a magic wand, and if I were Congress, if I were, say, a Congress of one, I would in some way, and politically this is very challenging, but in some way, find a way to either regulate or encourage those in the private sector to embrace certain minimum cybersecurity standards. I note that the Senate Intel Committee report on election cybersecurity encourages voluntary compliance with certain minimum cybersecurity standards. But I think that that's a common sense solution to a lot of our problems here, and we don't have that right now.
Let me pose one other brief question to General Alexander and Secretary Johnson on the Department of Defense in particular. I pick up frustration with some of our military folks that they are being held back from being able to use cyber tools to the extent they think makes sense. And I know there's a number of challenges. Using cyber tools may lose you intelligence gathering capability, all sorts of difficult legal issues, and we don't have time at this point to go into all of that. But I'm just wondering if either of y'all have an opinion about whether for the military use of cyber to create certain effects, are we moving out at an appropriate pace, or are we too hesitant to give, say, our combatant commanders and other military leaders the tools that we could give them, but because this is new and difficult, we're reluctant to do so?
Mr. Chairman, I think that the perception you detect is probably accurate among our military cybersecurity personnel. Without getting into too much detail, I know that some feel that the law and traditional law of armed conflict principles, traditional international law principles, restrain our ability to use some of our current capabilities. And so I share your perception.
Mr. Chairman, I think what's lacking in that regard is rules of engagement. So you have U.S. Cyber Command, who has a responsibility to defend the nation. And the issue really comes down to, when do you fire back? And what authorities do you need to get before you fire back to defend the country? Most of the time, it would be up to the commander of Cyber Command to do it and ask forgiveness. That's not a good place to put a military person in. You need rules of engagement that say, if I see an attack that is going to destroy our energy sector, our finance sector or something, and I've got 60 seconds to act, you want that person to do the right thing. You need to give them rules of engagement and get the government to agree, and you all to agree to those, and then train to them. And that's something I think that's sorely lacking, at least when I was commander of Cyber Command.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Smith.
Thank you. We've talked a little bit about the sort of rules of engagement. I think this is one thing that is a significant problem is our adversaries feel like they can operate to a certain degree with impunity because we have not made clear how to respond. What I'd like from you, and I'll give a little bit more of a preview of this, is what would that look like? If you said if you were God, what would you say? What should our rules of engagement be? Some have said that, a cyber attack is an act of war. I don't want to go there. I don't think that a cyber attack is equivalent to 9/11 or equivalent to if, Russia or anyone else were to launch missiles at us. I don't believe that if we suffer a cyber attack, we should start bombing whoever it is we think attacked us. What would be an appropriate response so that people felt like there was a price to pay if they continued to attack us through cyber? And they could do a lot worse than they've done, but there certainly have been, even as we sit here, I'm sure there are cyber attacks going on. No one knows what the consequences are. What should they be?
So I'll give you my thoughts on responding to an attack against a country, and I'll use the 2012 attacks that occurred. And in those times, it was my experience that the attacks that were coming against our country could have been stopped and turned off, not destructive attacks, but blocking attacks. But some of those blocking attacks would be in foreign space. So that creates the norms that Secretary Chertoff brought up, right, and some of the issues. Now, interestingly, most of those systems that are being attacked have been exploited by a bad guy to attack us. So the country whose device computer sits in their turf is actually being used to shoot us. In physical space, if somebody put a weapon in neutral space and started shooting at you, you have the inherent right for self-defense. I think we need a similar thing in cyber where you can defend it. Now, the administration needs beyond the blocking mechanism, so my rules of engagement aren't to go out and try to take out a country. It would be stop it, give the administration the opportunity to think of what elements of national power they want to use to counter it, and that could be diplomatic all the way to military. But what you're asking then the Cyber Command forces to do is block that attack and give you the time you need to make a decision on what elements of national power.
And just one sub-question on that. How easy is it to know where the attack is coming from? This is a matter of no small importance given our current debate about Russia and what they're doing in our elections and everything. You've sat there and you've looked at that, so all of you have. Is it really true that sometimes you can't tell, or are you pretty confident from your position that after a few hours, you know where it's coming from?
I think our attribution improved immensely, and you'd have to ask them where they are today, but from 2005 to 14, it was significant growth in attribution at network speed. The issue may not be that you have it down 100% of which element in a country is doing it.
Right.
But for the picture that I talked about, if you had that picture, it becomes increasingly clear, and the intelligence agencies can provide the rest of the picture if you give them the information at network speed. So hopping through a number of channels, what you need to do is see those at network speed. You can see how that plays out and pinpoint where it goes
So
back.
bottom line is we ought to be able to do it, so then we can have the appropriate, then once we figure out what the appropriate response is, at least we know who to send it to.
right.
Do you, either of you?
I would just, I'd add just a couple of elements to this. First of all, on the issue of attribution, the challenge is not only to determine which is the server from which the attack originates, but to what extent you can pin that on a government agency. One thing we've seen the Russians do is create a deniability situation with criminal groups, where essentially the argument is, as long as you don't commit crimes in Russia, you feel free to go do whatever you have to do overseas, but when we call on you, you will help us get into something. So that gets into a legal issue about how we hold countries accountable when they provide tacit encouragement. A second issue which is challenging is, unlike in the physical world where you could see a missile or a bomber coming from overseas, you could easily have a nation-state attack launched from a cafe down the street here in Washington from a thumb drive. We've built our doctrine in terms of what the military can do in terms of the away game and the home game, and we may need to revisit when we use some of our away powers for attacks that emanate from home.
I want to let some other people get in here, so just very, very quickly, how does the DoD's plan to move into the cloud and more use of open source software impact cybersecurity? If you could give me like just 30 seconds apiece on, because that's the direction we're heading in. How does that impact our ability to protect ourselves?
I think by and large it's a good thing. We need to do that to get the collective picture. So going there, I think you can provide the security, the secure web gateways and stuff that are coming in, the tools that are going. I think it provides better security. You alluded to that, and I think you're correct. It's more, it's easier to do it in that way. You just need to make sure you have the resilience.
Okay. Anybody else want to comment on that? All right. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'll go back.
Mr. Wilson.
And thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank each of you for being here today and your obvious many years of service to our country and dedication to the American people. And I want to begin by thanking Chairman Mac Thornberry for this very important hearing, as I believe that information warfare will expand beyond the current and future battlefield. I would also like to thank and congratulate Chairwoman Elise Stefanik for her leadership on the Emerging Threats and Capabilities Subcommittee, advancing American interests in cybersecurity to protect American families. A concern that I have, and General, you actually brought it up, and then you all have all touched on it, but it's so critical, and that is, how do U.S. agencies conduct a measure of cyber attack? Do all agencies share a common metric to measure a cyber incident? Last year, I introduced H.R. 1030, the Cyber Attack Standards of Measurement Study Act, which would require the Director of National Intelligence, in consultation with the Secretary of Homeland Security, the Director of the FBI, and the Secretary of Defense, to conduct a study to determine appropriate standards to measure the damage of cyber incidents for the purposes of determining the response to such incidences, and to include a method for quantifying the damage. In general, beginning with you, but actually all three of you, I'd like to know, do you believe that having a common interagency metric for measuring a cyber attack would benefit the coordination of response? And then secondly, should there be an appropriate counter-response to whoever conducts the attack? General.
I have some out of bounds thinking here on terms of DHS, but yes, I think you ought to do standards. I think I would take it one step further. I think the Department of Homeland Security, with what they're running in the MPPD and where they have the Security Operations Center should actually provide for the common defense for the rest of government and the ability to do it. I don't think the smaller government agencies have the technology and the people to do that. I would consolidate that just as business does and give that authority there. I think that would help in what you're trying to do.
Congressman, I think that the legislation you cited sounds like a good idea to me. I'd be careful, though, that in terms of trying to measure the effects of a cyber attack, it's not necessarily one size fits all, because you're assessing, say, the theft of personnel security records versus the theft of something in the Department of Defense. And I endorse what General Alexander said, that there are smaller federal agencies that are simply not equipped and need the Department of Homeland Security for a lot of help in this area.
And I'm in complete agreement with that suggestion as well.
Thank you again, and it is really just so frustrating to think of how blatant the attacks on American citizens, our government, our businesses, but not just us, as we see our allies in the Baltic states or our allies in Korea and Japan. Another concern I have is with attribution. We have a significant and persistent obstacle in facing our ability to respond. Do you believe that state actors, and again, General, you get stuck with this first, okay? But that state actors such as China and Russia take advantage of vulnerabilities in our ability to legally attribute a cyber attack? What can Congress do to address this issue of attribution?
Well, I think first, and Secretary Chertoff made a comment on the attribution, and I would just agree with that. That's very difficult, something that we need to work, and I believe Russia and China use forces that they can push out there to go after us, which makes this very hard. I don't know the best legal way to do it, but I think that's a discussion that has to be had as a nation. I think we're going to see that, and you've mentioned the Baltic states, Eastern Europe, and we're going to see it in the Middle East. And I believe with events going on in Syria and elsewhere, it's going to hit our country. So we need to get out in front of that.
I agree with what General Alexander said. I think, look, the challenge with attribution, I don't think is so much a technical challenge as a decision we have to make about, A, the level of certainty we need for certain kinds of responses, and B, the extent to which we're prepared to publicly reveal why we make a certain attribution. So we've seen lately, for example, the Department of Justice charged a couple of FSB, Russian intelligence agents, in the case involving the Yahoo hack. That's a good thing. I think sanctions can be a better thing. Now, if we were to get into something that was really seriously destructive with a loss of life, such that it might warrant a response at the level of warfare, then we might want a higher standard. I'd rather have that discussion, at least quietly now, than try to figure it out when we're in the middle of an attack.
Thank you very much. And Secretary Johnson, look forward to getting with you later. Thank you.
Ms. Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all of you for being here. Along with the discussion that we're just having, a little bit about IP abuse, and we know how destructive that can be. And what is a realistic course of action? And at what point do we know whether the actors have actually changed their behavior?
So let me take a crack at this. I begin by saying IP theft is not, in my mind, an act of war, but it's obviously wrong. I think one thing we could consider doing is this. If we see stolen IP actually being used by an enterprise, we could then, I think, go after the enterprise legally for that and exact a serious economic injury. And frankly, I think one of the reasons the Chinese agreed several years ago that commercial espionage to help their enterprises was not appropriate was a recognition that the sauce for the goose could become sauce for the gander as well. Now, I'm not naive. I don't believe they've totally stopped it. But I do think that using that kind of economic leverage can help.
I think it's the greatest theft of in transfer of wealth in history from our nation. It affects our future generations. So that IP theft, we've got to stop. I think sanctions and tariffs and other things are one way. More importantly, we need to fix our defense. Right now, we are so porous because as a nation, we are doing point defense on every point, and they are looking at this as a large target and only find one in and they're in, and everybody's going to make a mistake. So we've got to come up with a more comprehensive collective solution.
Oh, go ahead.
I agree that IP theft is a significant problem, and it encompasses national security as well. Theft of intellectual property by nation states is a significant problem that this committee should be very concerned about.
Could you speak a little bit more to who's in charge? Because we talk about, excuse me, we talk about an integration of effort, and yet it's difficult who actually is in charge. And when it comes to private companies, who do they see as in charge? What is their perception of who's actually making the rule?
We made an effort at this in the last administration, and there's always a temptation with every new administration to try to reinvent the wheel. But in general, the Department of Defense, NSA, Cyber Command should be responsible for defending the nation against an attack and the security of our military systems. Law enforcement should be responsible for threat response. In other words, you report the crime to law enforcement, whether it's the FBI, the Secret Service, or HSI. And the Department of Homeland Security should be responsible for asset response, the forensics, patching the vulnerabilities. And so the way I used to describe it when I was in office, Jim Comey is the cop and I'm the fireman. And you call both of us when you have an attack.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. But at the same time, I think there's, we're talking about a common operating theater, and are there authorities that still are unclear? And to what extent have we been a little slower to come to that, so that there is a common sense or a common knowledge, really, of.
Well, despite what I just articulated, I think that there is still a lot of a lack of public awareness about who is in charge. And it has to be a whole-of-government approach, but the lines of authority need to be reiterated and stressed over and over
Is there a
again.
cultural problem in doing that?
In my experience, cultural problems stem from the leadership. If the leaders of the organizations know and trust and respect each other, then that filters down in the culture. But leaders turn over. I thought at DHS we had an excellent working relationship with the FBI, in part because Jim and I were friends for over 25 years. And that filters down. But with each political turnover, with each new administration,
Right.
the personalities change.
And what role does the executive play in that?
I think that it's important for the executive to reinforce continuity and consistency in the protocols and how everyone should work together so that it eventually settles in to how we approach this issue.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Can I add to that one? Because I think it's important, the question that you're asking is who's in charge? You know, we had, when we were starting out and standing up Cyber Command, Secretary Gates had some great ideas about how you pull together all of government into a comprehensive solution. And he thought of, how do I pull what we're doing in the Defense Department, Justice Department, Homeland Security all together so that we can act in peacetime, seamless from peacetime to crisis to war. And I think that's the kind of solution that we need to look at as a country. And right now, it's, as you know, it's fragmented. And it was great working with Secretary Johnson. It was great working with Secretary Chertoff. But the reality is there are personnel issues, resource issues, technology things. And I agree, the FBI was great to work with for me. You know, they were amazing. And whenever we'd assume they'd have the lead because of law enforcement, but if it was nation state, it would flip to us. So I think you need to figure out, we need as a government to put that together somehow. Some have talked about a Secretary of Cyber. I'm not sure I would go that far, but I would sure look at how you nest between Homeland Security and Defense Department, common authorities, and a common structure between those to get that going and append to that FBI.
Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Johnson, you went to school in Atlanta at Morehouse, I know, and as we discussed earlier, in the city of Atlanta, on March 22nd was attacked with, as I understand it, the SamSam ransomware. The people asked for a $51,000 ransom, a fairly small amount, but my understanding is that that group has raised almost $1 million from different attacks, and these attacks have been going on since 2015 with that type of ransomware. Now the $51,000 is not a whole lot of money to a city like the city of Atlanta. The damage that was done and the cost to the city of Atlanta is going to be in the millions in shutting down courts, the inability to pay fines online, the loss of time of employees. I don't know what it will total up to, but it will be millions of dollars that the ransomware cost. My question gets into, so since this has gone on since 2015, the SamSam ransomware, has there been a coordinated effort from the U.S. government to find out where these attacks, these SamSam attacks, are originating and how we stop them? And if we do find out where they're originating from and who is doing it, how effective are our laws with regard to the prosecution of that crime, if it is in the U.S. or if it is outside of the United States?
A coordinated effort to, I don't know that there is within the FBI, for example, a bureau, a ransomware bureau devoted to those who engage in this. And as I think you point out, those who engage in ransomware are open and notorious. It's becoming a bigger and bigger business. I suspect that, and Mike could probably speak to this too, I suspect that the existing laws in Title 18 are sufficient to deal with this as a crime. But in my experience, most often, ransomware stems from a simple act of phishing or spear phishing, where an employee who uses a system opens up an email or an attachment that they shouldn't, and the actor is in the system, and they can steal things in the system. And so a large part of the answer to the ransomware problem is simply raising the awareness of those who use systems about opening emails that you don't recognize and attachments you don't recognize. But I suspect and believe that the existing laws are probably sufficient to deal with this once you can track down the bad actor.
So one of the questions that has been asked of Mark Zuckerberg is about the fiduciary duty to protect information. So banks, financial institutions, the government, the city of Atlanta would have a fiduciary duty to protect the information that they had in their computer systems. What about the networks? Should the networks have a fiduciary duty to protect the information that they are housing?
A fiduciary duty, if not a legal duty, to protect the information that they are the custodians of. A bank certainly has a fiduciary duty to protect information with which it is entrusted, and the management of these banks have fiduciary duties to their shareholders as well. And so I'm sure that there are certain obligations that those who manage networks have to the customers that rely on them.
I'm short on time. I guess the challenge I see in this area, if someone goes to work for a Google or an Oracle or a technology company, they may make in a month, if they're good, what we pay people in a year. And it seems to me that some way, somehow, the laws are going to have to incentivize those companies to do everything they can to stop these types of attacks. Not because we don't have capable people, but because there's so much of it going on out there that we need their help in doing this. And so sometimes they would see it even before we would see it. So I have an ag meeting at the top of the hour, but I appreciate all of you being here, and thank you for your service to the country.
Mr. Langsman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank our witnesses for your testimony today and for your service to the country. Over the many years that we have all worked on this issue of cybersecurity, I've had the pleasure of having you testify before me, and whether it's on the House Armed Services Committee or the House Intelligence Committee or the House Homeland Security Committee, and I've always deeply appreciated your thoughtful answers and your contributions to better protecting the country in cyberspace. So, the one question that I still continue to get from people back home is, why aren't we more effective at defending the country in cyberspace? Why are we still seeing these high-profile cyber intrusions or attacks, if you will? And obviously the answer is we're getting better at it, but it's a very hard thing to defend against. And we have the NSA, U.S. Cyber Command, that is in charge of basically defending the .mil network. The Department of Homeland Security is in charge of defending the .gov network, although they don't have the policy or budgetary authority to reach across government to actually compel departments and agencies yet to do what needs to be done. That's why I've long advocated for the bill I put in, the Executive Cyberspace Authorities Act, to have someone with that kind of policy and budgetary authority. But yet most of the damage can still be done in the .com world, particularly in critical infrastructure, and no one really is in charge there, no one has the authority, and I don't know the American people, would accept, and I don't think they would accept, having NSA or Cyber Command sitting on the network internally to defend in the .com world. So what is the best way forward to, in fact, defend the country? And General Alexander, you and I have talked about this. Right now, you've often referred to it as, we're still playing cleanup on aisle 9. So I'm interested further in your thoughts about the idea of deterrence in cyberspace. The new U.S. Cybercom Command vision talks about defending forward as far as possible before adversaries penetrate our defenses. And this sounds somewhat like the old adage of the best defense is a good offense. And so do you agree with this posture? And if we see things in cyber that, whether it's a nation state or a criminal enterprise is about to do something, is it best that NSA or U.S. Cyber Command inform private industry about the impending damage that could be inflicted and let them defend or fix the problem? Should NSA or U.S. Cyber Command take the action to stop it or turn it off, as you say? What is the best way forward to handle these challenges?
So first, I think in setting the defensive infrastructure, the first thing we need to do, and DHS would have the lead on, set the standards of what industry has to do. Here's how you lock your doors, here's how you encrypt your stuff, and set standards, and Congress can set incentives for small, mid-sized, large companies to do that. Then if they're attacked by something that exceeds those standards, they should have some form of protection. And part of that standard should include sharing information under law, CISA level information, not personally identifiable, but threat intelligence, cyber intelligence information at network speed with the government so the government can do what you suggest. And it falls then on the government, whose role is it? If it's criminal, it's going to go to FBI. If it's a nation state and an attack that's going to hurt our country, that's where you want Cyber Command and NSA to be actively involved. And if it's foreign coming in, you want NSA's intelligence to help inform law enforcement and the defense on how to defend that government. So I think the key thing that you can help do here is help industry set standards, give them the incentive to do that, and the liability protection if they meet those. Because the lawsuits are way out of bounds, and companies that are being attacked by nation states don't have the ability to defend. Sir.
So in the Cybersecurity Act of 2015, Congress established limits on criminal and civil liability for those who share cyber threat indicators with the Department of Homeland Security. So that's a good thing. The problem we have is, and we set up on my watch, automated information sharing with the private sector, and Keith is right. There's a lot that private sector can benefit from if we at the national level are able to share the threat streams that we see, but there's also a lot that the government can learn from the private sector, things that are happening within the private sector that the government doesn't necessarily know about right away. I've been disappointed that not more entities in the private sector are willing to share information with the Department of Homeland Security because they're concerned that it will go public, it will be compromised in some way, and that's a real problem. That's a real dilemma. There are many, including people in Congress, who believe that there ought to be mandatory disclosure by federal agencies in certain circumstances if we know about something. And that, frankly, compromises DHS's ability to encourage the private sector to come to us and work with us.
I know my time's expired, but thank you all for your testimony here today and your answers, and I yield back.
Ms. Stefanik.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have 3 questions, and I'm hoping to get through all 3. So I'll start with you, General Alexander. You helped build Cyber Command. What steps do we need to take in this year's NDAA process to mature Cyber Command? And then look forward 5 years. What does Cyber Command need to look like 5 years from now?
I think first, the unified command is the right next step, get them to a unified command. I think the rules of engagement discussion that we have is the second thing that I would push at. The third is with government as a whole, including Cyber Command, how do we defend the country? How do we as a government work together to defend this nation and bring it out and have a public discourse on how we're going to do that? Don't go into the tools and all that, but talk about why the information that's being shared is necessary to defend this country.
Thank you for that. My second question has to do with emerging technologies. When we consider what the world of cyber looks like, quite soon I think of threats like AI and quantum computing. How do these technologies play into future of cyber warfare and what we need to be thinking about as policymakers? I'll start with you, Mr. Chertoff.
Well, I think on AI, as with most technologies, there's an upside and a downside. There's no question from a threat standpoint, the ability of an adversary to automate the ability to test and try to break into a network, or even to use that for kinetic purposes, increases the threat. But the good news is, I think particularly if you use behavioral analytics, AI can be a good way of defending the network in depth, which is what we need to do. Quantum computing, I think, it raises some issues about encryption. And encryption is a major security tool. There's a view, however, that quantum computing could eventually make it very easy to penetrate encryption. It may also be the case, though, that it may be a tool to actually enhance encryption. So in both of these cases, I think we have to watch carefully to make sure that to the extent the threat is increasing, we are using these technologies to increase our resistance.
General Alexander, I'll go to you next, but I want to also add an additional question related. Are we underinvesting in these spaces?
Yeah, I was going to hit just on that, Ms. Stefanik. I think first, we have to lead globally in quantum computing and AI. The country that is the leader in those 2 technologies will be the future superpower. That needs to be us. And so we aren't investing enough, and this is a huge area. And there are some great experts in government at classified levels in both, and I would encourage you to get with those. I think in quantum computing, what Secretary Chertoff said is exactly right, both good and bad. AI, the same thing, and you've seen Elon Musk and Gates go at this, both pro and con. I think the good part of it, it will help us solve cancer and other things, and I think there's tremendous good. The bad parts, it means your decision cycle is going to be extremely fast in cyber, and the attacks are going to grow, so we have to be ready for that.
Mr. Johnson.
I agree with what Keith just said. I think that we need to invest in cyber talent in the federal workforce. All of our best talent at DHS, the people that can actually explain this to me, get stolen into the private sector because they're able to pay multiples of what we pay in the federal government. Congress has done some things to enhance our ability to hire cyber talent, but I think that's definitely a work in progress.
Thank you. And my last question, I'll try to get through quickly. Each of you have testified the importance of improving interagency coordination and information sharing. I want to drill down into the specifics. What specific actions can we take from the HASC perspective to improve this interagency collaboration and ensure that we are improving our readiness?
So one suggestion, and actually back in 2008, General Alexander and I talked about this, would actually be to co-locate representatives of the three major government agencies in a setting that would allow them to have a common operating picture in real time about what's going on.
We actually built a integrated cyber center up at Fort Meade where you would see the center of some of that. And so I would encourage that and build that common operating picture so that you can see the attacks and each part of government could coordinate what their response would be. Right.
DHS has actually built an integrated cyber center too, called the NCIC, the National Cyber Communications Integration Center. And it's an interagency operation, and I think we need to bolster that and improve upon that.
Thank you. My time's about to expire. I appreciate the answers.
Mr. Larson.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to yield my time to Mr. Khanna.
Thank you, Mr. Larson. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to our witnesses for your service to our country. Secretary Johnson, I was very impressed by footnote 5 in your testimony, where you talk about the definition of cyber warfare, and you explain your view that we should have a limited definition of cyber warfare. One could imagine the Russians creating cyber dislocation in Latvia, and the last thing we would want is to be bound under NATO to go to war over that. And I was surprised reading it that you wrote that we don't have a definition of cyber warfare in the government, and I'd be curious about your thoughts of what Congress or the government should do so we have a clearly defined standard for cyber warfare.
You're correct. We spent in the Department of Defense, as some members of this committee will know, literally decades writing a law of war manual that I think started in the 1970s, and it was finally published in 2013 or 14, and it barely touches upon cyber because cyber didn't exist when we began writing it. And so beyond answering the question, may a cyber attack constitute an act of war, there is a lot more that needs to be filled in the blanks. And what constitutes a cyber attack? What are the implications of that? What are the acceptable parameters for how we respond? What are the limits on the private sector in their responses? But the basic legal question is one I was interested in, and I basically defer to those who've already written on this, which is what I said in my statement, that you have to look at the kinetic effects rather than the kinetic means. And I caution against reaching for something that's too creative and too expansive because it would have implications globally. And so it's sort of like, be careful what you ask for. But I think there's a lot more work that needs to be done, limited simply to cyber, if you will, cyber warfare, what constitutes a cyber attack, and what are the acceptable protocols. And there are aspects of the existing laws of armed conflict that we can borrow from. Necessity, proportionality, distinction in a cyber response. I think there are elements of law of war principles that are useful in developing this, but it's something we have to undertake to do.
I appreciate it. I certainly learned a lot, and I hope you'll use your expertise to help guide this committee, Congress, and the executive branch as we try to define that so that we don't find ourselves in a war escalating because of too creative or expansive a definition. I was also struck where you talked about the coordination in the private sector with cyber security. I mean, it's always struck me that we don't have companies having their own armies. That thought would be absurd. And yet we have all of these companies having their own cybersecurity operations. And the question to any of the witnesses is, what can we do to make that less of a burden so that if you're a small business or you're a company, you don't have to have your own armed army to protect your cybersecurity? Is there a role for the federal government to do this, like we have an Army and an Air Force and a Navy to protect our nation?
Well, it's the basic response of national government to defend the nation against an attack. And on the civilian side, law enforcement, the Department of Homeland Security can share information, encourage best practices, but at the end of the day, whether you're the CEO of a large public company or you're the manager of your own business, you have to be responsible for the security of your own systems. And there are a lot of outside experts that can help with that in the private sector. This inevitably has to be a public-private endeavor because of the nature of cybersecurity.
Yeah, I would add to that, that I think for the smaller enterprises, there are now managed security services that can actually do that as an outsourced function. And one of the benefits they have is if they're working with a lot of different companies, they're seeing a lot of activity over the landscape, and that actually makes them better.
And I agree with that approach. I think the key is, and this is where Congress can help, if you set standards through DHS that industry meets, and you're protecting against what I'll call a reasonable threshold of attacks, and then somebody comes in with a nation-state-like attack, just as in the physical world, you have all your bank guards, you have all these folks working it. If a motorized rifle regiment comes in and wipes them out, you'd say, well, shoot, you should have had air defense systems. And the reality is when it gets to nation-state level, you have to have nation-state response. I think getting there means everybody gets to a certain standard and then shares at network speed across government so government agencies can do their specified roles.
That's very thoughtful. I really appreciate the testimony of the witnesses on this issue.
Mr. Banks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, in my state, we've already seen the consequences of cyber attacks. This past January, a criminal hacking group was paid $55,000 in Bitcoin as ransom to regain access to a hospital computer system at Hancock Regional Hospital in Greenfield, Indiana. This came at a time during flu season when the systems and the information they contain was critical to providing health care. While this was a criminal action by one group targeting a single hospital, the effects of a state actor using cyber attacks on the public health system or other critical infrastructure would be disastrous given the systematic vulnerabilities. So my first question for all three of you is, since much of the nation's critical infrastructure is privately owned, what efforts need to be taken now to better secure cyberspace activities essential to their daily operations? We can start with you, Mr. Chertoff.
Well, I think this is, again, there's not a magic bullet answer to this. And the analogy I often use is the public health analogy. How do we protect ourselves against disease and illness? It requires some things the government does in terms of formulating vaccines, but it requires us to take certain steps. So in the case you're talking about, look, a lot of these ransomware attacks occur because somebody downloads something they shouldn't, or because you haven't patched or updated. And those are things which are on the responsibility of the private sector actor to do. Then there are other elements, particularly when you're dealing with a nation state, where our ability to perceive that something is being readied for an attack could arguably call for us to act preemptively, certainly if there was the possible consequence of loss of life. So I think there's not going to be a single step. It's about raising the level of cyber hygiene for the owners or operators of the critical infrastructure. It's about backup for the critical data. It's about training people about the silly things they ought not to be doing. And then when you do see a nation state fixing to do something, then there's, I think, room to have a discussion about, do we act to blunt that away before it hits us at home?
General?
So I agree. I think setting the standards, getting everybody to build and work at those standards, and then sharing information across the government is the way to do this. Ransomware, the year of ransomware, 2016, 2017, it's going to continue. They're making money on it. And so the issue for the government will be, how do we respond between law enforcement, intel, and defense? And then what can we do in hygiene to help defend against that? And I think that's where the common operating pictures of what you're doing for incident response and helping critical infrastructure and what you're doing to defend the nation need to be merged.
I agree with everything that's been said. I would add to that there are lots of people who are part of critical infrastructure who don't know that they're part of critical infrastructure. For example, arguably, election infrastructure, before I made it explicit, was already part of critical infrastructure because it's part of government infrastructure. And so a beginning point is to educate those in critical infrastructure that they have a heightened duty and therefore need a heightened awareness.
So along those same lines, one of the difficult issues culturally for hospitals and other private sector entities is information sharing with the government about their systematic vulnerabilities. What can we or should we do to improve the culture of information sharing between the private sector and the government that would involve critical infrastructure? And Mr. Johnson, we can start with you.
We've already done a fair amount. Congress has already done a fair amount, as I mentioned earlier, by enacting limits on criminal and civil liability for those who share cyber threat indicators. DHS has established automated information sharing that has a privacy scrub that goes with it. And I think it's really a matter of raising the levels of trust and lowering the barriers of suspicion that exist right now. And there's a lot more work that needs to be done there because not enough in the private sector, in critical infrastructure, have the type of partnership that I think they need to have with DHS to effectively deal with this issue.
I think for most hospitals, there's 200 and some in New York City alone. They should outsource it and get a comprehensive solution across all of them. Their focus is on saving people. And if they're spending a lot of time trying to defend their networks and keep their equipment up, then they're not doing this. I think we have to look at it more like that. Secretary Chertoff brought up part of that, and I believe that's the correct way to go do it.
I would simply add to that. I think we need to educate hospitals and medical facilities that they are, in fact, critical infrastructure, and they are, in fact, targets. We have information sharing and analysis organizations that are platforms for sharing. One other thing, though, I would say, and I've talked to people in the medical community on this, as we multiply smart medical devices that are connected to the internet, we have to be very careful we're not creating serious vulnerabilities that would lead to a loss of life. So pacemakers or various kinds of injection pumps, if they are wirelessly connected, can be very beneficial, but the devices can also be an attack vector, and we need to look to the FDA as well as the industry to focus on that.
Thank you. My time has expired.
Mr. Veazey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. General Alexander mentioned something earlier, but I think that anyone can answer this. And I wanted to know, do you think that we should be looking at bolstering the military and State Department when it comes to dealing with this issue? And the reason why I mention that is because it seems to me that if attacks on small to mid-sized allies are occurring, that also may be an issue of governance that they have within their countries by not being able to manage all of this. And just wanted to know if you had any thoughts on that.
I do think alliances are going to be extremely important in cyber. And it's important for two reasons. One, to get the norms and the group together. And second, we learn a lot by seeing where others are attacking. Most attacks that hit our country are tested elsewhere. The more partners we have, the smarter we'll be in defending ourselves.
And also, General Alexander, wanted to ask you, because small and mid-sized allies and certain countries that we are trying to give assistance to, they've had trouble managing their natural resources. How do you help countries like that manage something as sophisticated as cyber, defense? Like how do you empower them to do that when they've had trouble just managing just basic needs of running a country, previous to all the cyber issues that we had?
So that's more difficult. I think there are some countries that you can help right off the bat, and I encourage our government to work with those that they can help protect. You can see a live fire in terms of cyber going on in the Middle East. Partnering with the Middle East to help solve that is going to be extremely important. The same in Asia. We're seeing a lot of attacks, and in Eastern Europe. Each of those have different groups. I was in a discussion with some of the folks from NATO a couple of days ago, doing a common defense with NATO and helping them set a standard would lighten our load, increase what they could do, and bring that collective body together as well.
And Secretary Johnson, I wanted to ask you, you said in your comments earlier that you think that there should, if you had your way, that you would have businesses and governmental entities have some sort of minimal standards when it comes to protecting their cyber. I wanted to ask you about the cost to that. Do you think that in order for smaller or mid-sized businesses and even smaller municipalities to be able to really put the protections in place that they need, like how much money would something like that run a smaller entity? That could certainly be maybe a softer target. It wouldn't be as large of a target as a large city, but could certainly be a softer target. Like what sort of resources would they need to bring to the table in order to meet those minimal standards?
Well, it depends on the nature of a business and the nature of the information it possesses and how it conducts business. Without a doubt, encouraging companies, either legislatively or otherwise, to embrace best practices probably means embracing a certain level of technology. But we are all as strong as our weakest link. And so if you have a company in a supply chain that invests millions and millions of dollars in their own cybersecurity, but they do business with a supplier that doesn't, then the big supplier up the chain is at risk because they're doing business with somebody who doesn't see this as an issue. But in my engagements in the private sector, I would encourage CEOs to view cybersecurity in the same way they would view physical security, the care and custody of their customers' intellectual property and so forth, so that we don't view this as simply a side issue that's going to require some money. It's a basic issue of security. As someone mentioned earlier, in many cases it implicates a fiduciary duty that someone may have. And so, sure, is it going to be an investment? Absolutely. But if you want to be the best at something, you've got to make investments in technology.
Right. And it would be interesting, my time is about to expire, and I'll just add this at the end. You know, it would be interesting to get your comments on, like, let's say a company that supplies a defense contractor, a small, mid-sized company that is a supplier, for them to be able to meet those same requirements could be much more onerous than the defense contractor, for instance. So just something to think about. Mr. Chairman, I yield back my time. Thank you.
Mr. Heiss?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. General Alexander, you've made a recommendation to bring responsibility for private sector outreach and the defense community under a single authority. Can you elaborate further on that and why that's important?
Well, I think having unity of effort is very important. And right now, everybody's really busy. And I look at how hard Homeland Security, with all the things they're doing, Defense Department with what they're doing. When I was asked earlier by one of the members, why aren't we making more progress? And the answer is everybody's busy handling a lot of things. Do you appoint somebody and hold them accountable for moving this and going back to Homeland Security, Defense Department, and Justice to get it done? I think the answer is yes. And where and how you place that entity is where I would get the Secretaries of Defense, Homeland Security, and Department of Justice together and say, iron it out. I think with Secretary Gates, Secretary Chertoff in their seats back then, another couple of years, I think that would have been solved. And now I think what we need to do is look at that and say, how do you do that? Because there are specific missions. You don't want the Defense Department going out and trying to police up all the incident response. You don't want them setting standards and looking. That's Homeland Security, and they have that, and they should do that. You want the Defense Department to defend the country. But both of those require for you to see this and have this entire spectrum of cybersecurity visible to all the actors. It's not there, and we need to fix that.
I'd like to hear your opinion from the other gentleman, Mr. Chertoff.
I mean, I agree with General Alexander. I do think that there are distinct roles and responsibilities. The key is to have clarity about who supports and who is being supported in each of those roles.
Okay.
I agree with that. Yes, sir.
So all three of you agree that there ought to be a single authority, however that's decided. Then, now, when I walked in a little while ago, Secretary Johnson, you were touching on this, so I'd like to, I'll just go, General Alexander, regarding how to improve the ability to recruit and retain our cyber experts. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, what we did, Congressman, at Cyber Command, we're not going to keep all these guys for a long time, but if you can get them to commit for 6 years and get them training for a year, this would be great for our country, both in the military, in government, and then in industry. So I think what the government can do is help train and educate a large population, not just for the Defense Department, but also for Homeland Security. And part of that training could be, we'll provide your training, you commit to a period of time in government. And, I really believe that young people should serve in government. I really do. And so this is a way to incentivize it, and you give them a future, and you help our country. That's what I would do. There are many young folks out there that can't afford college, but they are built for cyber, and we ought to latch on to them.
So what time frame do you think they ought to be able to make a commitment?
Well, I would go for 6 years, with one of those or 1.5 being a commitment for education. And I would advance the education similar to what the Defense Department does for the Joint Cyber Ops Center or school. But I would do that a little bit longer with some of the defense and all that. And I would mix them all together. And the reason is you want the people that work in government to work together.
Okay.
And so the military and civilian.
I see some head nodding.
I would concur with what he said. My message when I was in office to young people continually was, if you want to go work for Citigroup or Goldman Sachs or J.P. Morgan Chase in cyber, come serve your country for a few years and get the benefit of those insights. And then the struggle becomes, they all are drawn to the perceived cool agencies like NSA, and so we have to encourage them to want to work in the civilian agencies as well.
Okay. Last question is in your opinion, is the cyber mission force adequately sized for the challenges it faces? General?
I think it is right now.
Okay.
What I would encourage is a set of exercises with that force, with the rest of government, and perhaps key players from industry and Congress to look at that and see the challenges. I think the teams and the constructs of the teams were right. We based those on other teams that were very successful for our country. So I think it was the right thing. We were encouraged initially to cut it back, and I said, but this is what it takes. And we 40 teams of a certain type offensive, 68 defensive teams that would work with DHS and others, and the 25 analytic teams. I still think that's right.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield.
Mr. Karamindy.
First of all, Mr. Chairman, thank you for setting up this hearing. It's extremely important, and the three gentlemen that are testifying have a wealth of wisdom. If I might, recently the Department of Homeland Security issued an alert that Russia had hacked into critical civilian infrastructure, gaining access to our power grids, power plants, and other industrial plants, and in some instances, gaining operational control. Is this an act of war? I think that word was used by the Department of Homeland Security. If yes, what is the appropriate response?
Congressman, I would characterize what is in that statement as a very significant threat to our nation and our national security, but I would not characterize it in and of itself as an act of war.
I agree with that. I mean, I think that, and it's often difficult to tell when you find malware in a network what the purpose of it is. Often it has multiple purposes. It could be at one level reconnaissance. It could be deterrence in the sense of a way of signaling to the U.S., look what we can do, and therefore, if you mess with us, we're going to do this. Or it could be pre-positioning something for an attack, or all three of those. But I would agree with Secretary Johnson that positioning is not the same thing as actually carrying out an act of war. Now, if you shut the lights off and there was a serious loss of life, then we're getting into territory.
Well, they did shut down a reservoir, if I recall correctly. Let me just move on. So it's not an act of war. That brings us to the rules of engagement, doesn't it? And to the definition thereof. We're not going to get to that today, but all of you have said this is critically important. General Alexander, you've danced around this issue of being able to comprehend when an attack is underway and to be able to act. You haven't been specific about that. If you would take a moment or two to discuss that. And then my final question is, we have an annual exercise with Cybercom working with DHS and so forth. Well, I'm going to hold General Alexander my question to you. I want to stay with this other question I had. So that annual exercise would seem to be exactly what this Russian intervention, we won't call it an act of war, but intervention into our critical grids was designed to deal with. So what comes of this? Should we not be using the techniques that come from that annual exercise to deal with this Russian hacking into these grids?
So I think the issue for them hacking into this grid is they are trying to get insights into the operations of our network for future use. I agree with what Secretary Chertoff said. I don't think this is an act of war. I think it's an act of intelligence gathering and positioning for future conflict. What it does show you is that we have to have visibility of those types of attacks. So you asked specifically, what does that mean? And I'll give you an example. If you look at what happened to Saudi Aramco, the destructive attack into Saudi Aramco with a wiper virus actually went on for about 2 months. No one had insights into that because nobody's looking at Saudi Aramco. And our government cannot see today actively what's going against our energy sector. The energy sector actually has been the best to work with in this area. They are pushing to really step that up. I think their Strategic Infrastructure Coordinating Council and things that they put forward is exactly right, but it needs to go the next step. How do you get that data up to government so you can build that picture so you can see Russia coming in? And the answer is you don't see that. NSA doesn't see it, Cybercom doesn't see it, DHS doesn't see it. So what happens is they're getting hit. They don't have the ability to share it. They don't know they're getting hit, or they would have stopped it. So our common operating picture, it's like it's free for them to get in. We have to build this system up and make that visible.
We're going to write the National Defense Authorization Act in the next 2 months. What should be written into that to deal with this precise problem?
Well, I think it's to build a common operating picture and sharing. I would emphasize the CISA Act of 2015 and take it to the next step and say, and encourage companies and government to work together and to train and practice with that. I would look at this Strategic Infrastructure Coordinating Council and encourage councils like that where you bring industry into government to share this information is exactly right. That puts CEOs in the seat.
You used the word encourage.
Strongly. I don't know what you can do with industry, but you don't have to encourage them hard. I think, I don't know that you need to mandate it because I do believe they're sitting forward. They want help. They want the government to help them. They know they can't defend against a nation state. And they know that, especially in the energy sector, they're critical to the future of this country.
I'm well over my time. I'll yield back, but I'd love to have you gentlemen help us write that encouragement.
Ms. Hartzler.
Thank you, gentlemen. I appreciate your expertise and insights on this really critical issue. The Missouri National Guard was the first state to fully staff a National Guard computer network defense team to respond to cyber threats and attacks. And this unit, located at Jefferson Barracks in St. Louis, is consistently sought out to train both National Guard forces across the country as well as active duty. These National Guard members are in a unique position because they can utilize their civilian roles, training, and expertise into their military cybersecurity roles. I think we can all agree that the private sector moves faster with technological innovation, so by using citizen soldiers, we can leverage new ways of thinking into the military. So what do you think should be the force structure of active duty, reserve, and National Guard cyber warriors? I'm not sure who wants to start off.
So actually, you've hit on it. When at Cyber Command, we encouraged, and we had several states set up National Guard with cyber forces, Delaware, Mississippi, Washington, and others for just that reason. I think that is an exceptional way, and you hit all the key points. There are great people in the commercial sector who want to help the government, but they don't want to sacrifice the pay, so they can do both, and they do, and there are great people there. I think that's exactly the way to go. The issue that will come up is now how do we bring those all together for the common defense as things go from peacetime to crisis to war, something that we need to look at.
And I think you mentioned as well that you support training them and then having a 6-year requirement. In a way, this kind of fulfills that a little bit. We train you and then you can go out in the private sector, but then come in on the weekends and you bring your expertise and to address things and to be called up when needed. Secretary Chertoff?
Yeah, I was going to say, I think it's a little bit like the ROTC. I think that's a great idea. I mean, if you, these days we're looking to train people for the 21st century skills. If you bring them in, you train them, they make a commitment to serve active for a period of time, and then they work in the National Guard, that's a win-win for everybody. There are two other advantages. One is the relationships that are built wind up going on beyond the actual term of service. And one of the things I learned in law enforcement was a lot of the sharing and a lot of the coordination comes from personal relationships. And secondly, in terms of a common language and a common approach, it gives you a baseline commonality. So, I mean, if you were going to do something relatively dramatic, I think having an ROTC type program to train and get service in this area would actually be a real benefit.
Makes sense. When I visited this unit, even though it's not in my district, I was so impressed. Several of them said, we are in charge of security for Fortune 500 companies. And we see things during the week, and we're saying, oh my goodness, we need to come, when we come back on our active duty assignment and apply those things to, protect our nation. So it makes sense to me. Mr. Johnson, were you wanting to add something there?
No, I endorse everything that's been said.
Very good. I wanted to go back, General Alexander, to something you said that piqued my attention in your testimony, and then just recently, as you were talking about integration of infrastructure, and I understand this isn't quite the same, but there's a lot of discussion about the DoD's contract and building the cloud, and whether it should be one cloud or whether there should be multiple clouds that would use. Do you have an opinion on that?
Well, I think in any instance, a cloud provider is going to have multiple instances, and so I would look for multiple instances for resilience. And no matter which one you choose and how you choose it, that means you don't put all your eggs in one facility. So when you think about the cloud, they build up a huge set of capabilities in a facility, and then they build multiple facilities to give you that resilience. I would look at the facilities, the resilience, and there are tremendous companies out there doing cloud capabilities, and that's growing. I think that's part of the future, especially for mobile communications. So.
Okay. And the last question, switching gears a little bit, what are we doing to mitigate the exfiltration of massive amounts of unclassified data from our cleared defense contractors? And is it working, and what would you do differently to protect this data? Let's take that.
Well, I worked with the Defense Industrial Base, and great people. I would pull them together into an integrated infrastructure, call it a DIB infrastructure that works together so you can see what nations are going after defense information or related information, encourage those. We actually ran that when you were the General Counsel. We called the Defense Industrial Base Working Group. We didn't go into it to that level, but I would build that up. Analogous to the way we recommended doing the same thing for small and mid-sized agencies. I would do that and offer that for the DIB as part of the way of them bringing in. So beyond FedRAMP, which is the standards that they have to achieve in cybersecurity, I would go for a collective security approach.
Thank you. You're back.
Mr. Gallego.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Kind of attaching some questions on to my good friend from Missouri, and talking to some of my friends, we have a dearth of actual capable cyber warriors. And I have some friends that I served with in the war that actually came out and created and went through all these different programs to actually retrain them to be quote-unquote cyber warriors. But I've heard criticisms from colleges and universities that these programs are too staid and too static to adequately train students for the real-world threats that are always changing. So do you, one, see the quality and quantity of cybersecurity graduates as a problem? Number two, if so, what can be done to improve the dynamism and efficacy of cybersecurity education currently right now through our public and private schools, or any other methods? We could just start from left to right.
Well, I have to say I've been impressed recently when I visit colleges and universities at the level of interest in a cybersecurity education. And very often there's also an interest in serving in national security in cybersecurity. It doesn't surprise me that you've heard some of the concerns that have been expressed because really of the newness of the topic. And so there probably needs to be a concerted effort at who are the educators, because this is a rather new generation phenomenon. So there's a lot of
Secretary,
interest at the student level.
And who is going to be providing the curriculum also? I know the educators are important, but also sometimes the educators are behind the eight ball when it comes to curriculum.
Correct. Right. I agree with that.
So let me just add, DHS and NSA actually have a joint venture to work with colleges to set up a level of curriculum. So I think that's a great starting point. More importantly, look at the change in technology. It's doubling every 2 years. That means half of what kids learn in their freshman year is outdated by their junior year. So we are training people for technology that doesn't exist, hence the problem that you bring up. Using applications that haven't been created. And so what that means is we now need to teach people how to learn, not just what to learn. And that's got to be part of this whole process. And I think that's what you're actually getting to.
I would agree with that. I think a critical point is what you're doing is training people how to train themselves. And that way it can be a continuous process, because it's not going to be like most subjects where you learn it and then it remains current, because it's going to change very, very quickly.
In many of the universities that I've visited, or even community colleges, there is usually like a corporate advisory board, just basically that meets with the professors and with the educators to create a curriculum that is always staying up to date with whatever changes, not just obviously in cybersecurity or technology, but whatever field that they're working on. What is our equivalent in our government to that? Is there a working group of both national leaders, defense leaders, as well as private sector leaders that are helping, we're helping our educators, whether it's community college or universities, keep up to date the curriculum? I know we kind of hit on that, but is there an actual formalized structure for this kind of interaction?
So they actually do that between DHS, NSA, and now Cyber Command. They update that curriculum all the time, and it's on the web. So you can actually go to the Information Assurance Director.gov, I think is IAD, and I think DHS has the same one, and it lays out all the standards, and they update that continuously.
And then is the private sector at all involved in this curriculum, making of this curriculum?
Well, to the extent that they reach out, but they aren't part of the accreditation process.
Right.
I believe they provide input from where both DHS and NSA.
Understood. Thank you. I yield back.
Mr. Bacon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank all three for your service and your leadership. I appreciate you being here. I have a few questions for General Alexander, and if time permits, one for the whole panel. First of all, for General Alexander, right now we have 1 4-star for NSA, Cyber Command, and the 2 deputies, the 3 stars, sort of run those organizations. But that provides us cohesion, unity of command. But yet I know there's proposals to provide 2 different 4-stars, one for each NSA and Cyber Command. And I fear that that will pull those teams apart, because I know, and you know, I'm a cyber and SIGINT guy by trade as well, that our intelligence needs to be closely linked with our offensive and defensive capabilities. I'd like to know, where do you fall on this, and where are we at with this discussion?
Well, I actually believe you have to have unity of command. If the decision is made that it's too big for one person, and then you put 2 4-stars, you then have to put somebody over top of both of them, between
Absolutely.
them and the Secretary and the DNI. And so that creates additional infrastructure. So before we do that, I would encourage us to look at how we're going to fight in cyberspace and the roles and missions of both NSA for reconnaissance and Cyber Command for military actions. And NSA may have responsibility in covert actions. So you have this nesting. I think I would look towards unifying versus diversifying those capabilities.
My experience is the same. I just know there's proposals here to do that, to separate it. And I think it would be damaging to the cyber mission, because the intelligence portions of this are so closely linked to our offensive and defensive. You can have 2 4-stars with 2 different priorities and keep those teams cohesive. So I just wanted to make that point, and I appreciate that you feel the same way. On the cyber mission teams, are we fully operational or initial operational? Where are we at?
Well, so I'm a bit dated. I've talked to Admiral Rogers, and they've made great progress. My understanding is they are, in most of them, fully operational capable, but I'm not sure how many of the 40 are at that level and where they've tested them. So I know we were making progress 4 years ago. I have not kept up specifically on that. I do think this will get back to now we have another group that we're going to be training and always going through. So I don't know the answer to that.
Okay, thank you. One more question, then I got one for the panel. I think you talked about the right to self-defense. Let me just play on that a little bit. I think if we're only defensive, we play defensive only, it doesn't serve deterrence well, and I think it makes us more of a punching bag. I think we do need to have to practice some of our offensive muscles, mainly to serve as deterrence and make attacks on us less often. Are we doing enough in the offensive realm to show, hey, when you attack us, you're vulnerable for a counter a strike? But where do y'all? And I'll open up for anybody if you feel like we're in the right spot here.
Congressman, as long as our intelligence chiefs tell us that certain nation states are continuing to engage in bad behavior against us in cyberspace, then the answer is no, we're not doing enough, obviously. And nation states, whether they're communist regimes, dictatorships, monarchies, all behave a certain way. They all decline to engage in behavior that is cost prohibitive if there is a sufficient deterrent in place. And to go back to what you said earlier, I believe that components of an effective defense can also include offense.
All right. Go ahead, sir.
Yeah, I would agree. I would say there are two elements of deterrence: deterrence by denial, which means we raise the barrier to doing something, and deterrence by response. We've done some things, particularly lately, that are a little more responsive, but as we see bad behavior, we may need to dial that up a little bit. The one thing I want to just be careful about is not to treat the issues about information operations as the same thing as cyber attacks, because that raises a whole set of complicated issues.
Intelligence versus offensive is
Correct.
totally two different things, and reconnaissance has a long history of being not a combat operation, so I totally agree. It is my feeling, too, that we're not showing enough teeth or offensive muscle, and it doesn't serve deterrence well. It makes us more vulnerable to the other nation's attacks. One last question, and this gets to some of the earlier questions on the energy grid. I'm deeply alarmed by it. I think we are vulnerable to the next December 7th not being airplanes and torpedoes, but rolling blackouts and havoc in our society. Are we doing enough to build resilience in the defensive realm to protect our energy grid? And it really is more of a Homeland Security perspective.
I've been impressed that certainly larger entities in public utilities recognize their vulnerabilities and the risk and are doing a fair amount. Again, I come back to the importance of information sharing about threat streams. And no matter how sophisticated you are, you can always benefit from more information, the larger picture at work. And that's where I think we need to continue to focus, and where I think Congress should continue to encourage the private and public sectors to work together and share information.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. I'm out of time, so I yield back. Thank you.
Mr. Panetta.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to the three gentlemen who are here today. I appreciate you being here, as well as, of course, your stellar service, so thank you very much. Clearly, cyber attacks are one of the main tools of what's been termed lately as guerrilla geopolitics, and what is being used more and more by the revisionist powers that we're hearing about. You today have done a good job saying what is not an act of war. And Mr. Chertoff, you started to get to the point in Mr. Garamandi's questioning about shutting off the lights, significant loss of lights. Could the three of you please give me further examples, in your opinion, obviously, of what you would feel would qualify as an act of war using this tool?
Congressman, any cyber attack that has kinetic effects, physical destruction, death, physical injury, in my judgment, would constitute an act of war.
I agree with that, and I think what I would emphasize is this: it's effects-based. It's not based on the particular tool.
Right.
Whether you're dropping a bomb or you're sending something over a network, if you're killing people, that's an act of war.
For example, we look at chemical weapons, and we measure the impact by the effects that chemical weapons have, then we see the images. So I think you have to focus on the effects.
Understood.
I would add in intent. So I believe you're going to see some countries who push out something, and we've seen this already here in our country, where the attack was going against a different, but the malware hit our country and hit some of our industry. The intent wasn't to hit us. It was a collateral damage, not an act of war, but something that they should be held accountable for. I do think so. If they have the intent to do us harm and they have the kinetic effects to go with it, I believe that's an act of war.
And if the means were solely done through cyber, should the response be solely done through cyber?
As a legal matter, the answer is not necessarily. There is no legal requirement for a response in kind.
Yeah, and I agree. I think you want to hold all the elements of power and give the administration the authority to use them all.
Good.
I also agree.
Good, good. And I would imagine the three of you are familiar with the Talon Manual 2.0. Would you feel that this is that basically that the principles that are articulated in this under international law, are they effective?
It depends what you mean by effective. I think that international law and law of armed conflict ought to apply, again, cyber as well as kinetic. Whether people are observing them is a different issue. The challenge here becomes, it's easier to mask what you're doing in cyberspace generally than what you're doing in the physical space. So you get a lot of denial and deniability, which is why ultimately enforcing the rules comes back to the level of certainty you need to have with attribution. The value of this, though, is particularly with respect to our allies, and I've had discussions with them about this. If they agree with us that there's a violation of international law by what another country does, then they are prepared to take countermeasures that would be more vigorous than if they viewed it as not being a violation of a law of armed conflict.
Would you agree? Great. And Mr. Johnson?
The one legal issue that I think deserves a lot of attention in this area are the principles around neutrality. We talked about this earlier, and Mike talked about this earlier, where there's a nation state that is doing something directed at us originating from a neutral country. And the current principles, frankly, are insufficient to deal with this problem. And it's something that we confronted time and again at DOD, and I'm acquainted with at DHS. And so I think that more thinking needs to be put into what do you deal with when an attack is originating from or working its way through a neutral country. How do you deal with that?
Got it. Got it. Gentlemen, thank you. I yield back. Mr. Chairman, thank you.
Mr. Carbajal.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Enemies that wish to destabilize our democracy have found a new frontier that I believe we are not adequately prepared for, and as you have touched on in your testimony. Today, I'm interested in the role of the National Guard in response to a potential cyber attack. As a military asset with dual state and federal roles, I believe they have a critical role to play in protecting our nation's critical infrastructure. If a cyber attack were to shut down critical infrastructure sectors, such as the electrical grid, water, banking, or transportation systems in California, an interagency response would be necessary. Law enforcement, first responders, owners of infrastructure sectors, the National Guard, and other federal and state entities must have an integrated response and know how to work together. But this requires us to train in a more integrated environment. In this regard, I believe there is a significant training gap. Currently, there are no local programs in place that I am aware of for cyber network defense teams to receive continuous training to defend the Department of Defense information networks while exercising their defense capabilities in a state environment. Army cyber protection teams currently report to Fort Meade to receive training in their Title X mission, but they still lack training relative to defending critical infrastructure. In California, the National Guard has embarked on a collaborative, multi-agency cybersecurity training effort that provides an environment specifically created for integrated training, allowing them to exercise their defense capabilities in both a federal and state environment. Now, I know you've touched on this already, but I'm hoping that you could elaborate on it a little bit more. What are your thoughts on the need to expand integrated training efforts, including interagency cyber training facilities?
So
I think we absolutely need to do it. And you bring out some good points in terms of what are the roles and responsibilities at the state level, what are the roles and responsibility at the federal level, and how do you connect those two, and then how do you build both the bridges to the private sector? And all of that has to work seamlessly together. I think it's about training. I think first and foremost, we have to come up with a vision of how we're going to defend this country in cyberspace and get everybody to agree. That's part of that common operating picture. With that picture, then, the second question that you've just posed is, so what's the role of state and National Guard and other forces in helping to accomplish that mission? How far can they go? Because what you don't want is states to independently attack back. You want them to defend, or if they're going to attack, to be part of the federal, the national response, not individual. So we have to ensure that all that is bound together, and that is a tremendous training requirement from my perspective.
I agree with everything General Alexander said.
I would add one thing. I'd like the training to include not only defending, but the ability to recover when something goes down, as we do in the area of training the National Guard when we have a natural disaster.
Thank you. And a follow-up question. I know this has been touched on as well today. Cyber security is such of a complicated issue. And you touched on earlier about threats emanating from neutral areas or neutral countries. How difficult is it to pinpoint the origination of the attack? Is it 100% of the time we ultimately get to that source, or sometimes we never get to that source? What is the percentage success rate that we are aware in pinpointing the actual threats? Because that leads to attacking or counterattacking somebody who may or may not be the original source.
In my observation, it's often the case that we can identify where the attack is originating from, what platform, but then the challenge becomes who's pulling the strings, who's ultimately responsible, and who's ultimately orchestrating the attack. And I'm sure the other two witnesses will have views on that as well.
I actually agree, and Secretary Chertoff brought some of those same points out earlier, that you can see where it starts from. So it might start in Russia, but Russia could say, the Russian government could say, that's not us, that's a hacker, he's outside. Having said that, the problem that our companies would have in National Guard and others is they can see the last point coming to them. What they can't do is see all the other points leading back to Russia. That's where your national intelligence system has to work. And it goes back to Mr. Bacon's question. You need to have the ability to see that whole threat and then respond. Title 10 and Title 50 integrated. And so I think that's going to be the key for our country.
Thank you very much. I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. That concludes our member questions. I want to thank the three witnesses here today for sharing your policy expertise and your recommendations as we move forward. Just as an announcement, the Emerging Threats and Capabilities Subcommittee, which I chair, is having our cyber posture hearing at 3:30 p.m. With Admiral Rogers and Assistant Secretary Ken Rapuano to continue this conversation. Thank you very much for your service to our nation, and this hearing is adjourned.